I actually don't have notes. What I have is a bunch of things from this book that I wrote. I noted some pages that I thought were relevant to this conversation. So I did that really quickly. So the Hero with a Thousand Faces is, of course, famous for the hero's journey. But that is like the first half of the book or so, where he talks about, the classic hero's journey that we all know, also known as the monomyth. He actually calls it, and here he has his own phrase. I think those are words that we've given to it. He calls it the adventure of the hero. But Joseph Campbell, he also identifies some other mythic structures and types of stories. He talks about like the cosmological cycle, so like patterns of stories of creation, and also the life of the hero. So he talks about births and childhoods, and I don't know. I just thought it was some interesting conversation starters. One of the things I want to mention first is that one of the things that's lesser known by people who haven't read it is that he actually identifies 5 types of heroes. I definitely think there are more. One being the hero as martyr, which came up today. It's very important in Christianity. It sounds like it's important in Islam as well. He doesn't mention that, but he has 5.
Again, in Islam, it's important because martyrdom is immortality, right? It's
right.
My nose is like running. I apologize for that sweet.
That's fascinating.
I'm sick. My nose is running. Told me, so please forgive me for the disgustingness.
No, I didn't even notice.
I did. It's okay. We all got everybody knows. It's okay. I'm human. I'm human. I'm a fully human person.
We don't believe it, Cameron. You human?
What? No way.
I'm going to throw this away. I'm listening to you. Hold on a second. I'll be back in 1 second.
You're good. So the first is the hero as warrior, of course. So as he describes it, again, I'm saying as he because I think sometimes I don't always agree with him, but this is just his argument. So he has the hero as warrior, which the hero faces a monster, tyrant, or dragon that needs to be destroyed. And in his examples, it isn't always destroyed by violence, isn't always a male hero, but it's destroying some sort of, monster or tyrant. So that's the hero as warrior. Hero as lover, the reward is the marriage bed. So these are these myths where there's some sort of difficult task that must be completed in order to earn the right to, sleep with some magical maiden or some goddess or something like that. So that's number 2. Number 3, this is a fascinating one for another discussion someday. The hero as emperor and tyrant. In this case, you have a hero who has some sort of spiritual insight. They bring enlightenment, wisdom, and or law. I definitely think Moses is an archetype that fits into this type of hero.
And the prophet Muhammad is as well, the lawgiver. So yes.
Yes. So sometimes it's straight from a divine source. But it's one of the negative things of this type of hero is in a position of power and respect, they can corrupt, letting it get to his head, and then he becomes the tyrant people need to be delivered from. So that doesn't always happen, but it can happen with that type of hero.
Well, that's the risk. That's the inherent risk. Yes.
Exactly. Number 4 is the hero as world redeemer. So this is relevant. So this kind of a hero brings enlightenment and spiritual truth. But not from a divine source, rather as a divine source. So it's some sort of like a God or divine being that walks among us. Obviously, Jesus in the Christian tradition is a hero as a world redeemer. I do wonder how many there are. Like, I do wonder if Joseph Campbell is just kind of talking about Jesus.
Any classification is
right.
Cramming stuff in, but let's look at these. For example, let's look at Jesus. Maybe look at Prophet Muhammad as a counterpart. So let's look.
There's one more. Wait, I should do the 5th one.
I'm sorry, one more.
There's one more, and then you can see how it is with Muhammad. But the 5th one is hero as saint, and this one is a fascinating one. So in hero as saint, that's different from hero as world redeemer or hero as the emperor bringing spiritual truth. So the hero as saint finds spiritual revelation. They're not like divine necessarily, but the hero leaves and does not return. So that's a difference to the normal hero's journey kind of a thing. Like they find spiritual, truth, and then they go off onto some other plane or something, and they don't return. Buddha is interesting because he could be either 4 or 5, depending, I think, on what version of Buddhism you're following.
Theravada, Mahayana, all of them, they got their own thing going on. Yeah.
Right. So those are the 5. What were you going to say?
Okay, so why don't we go over the 5? Let's look at Jesus, because this is about nativity, right? And so it'll be interesting because I do think that Jesus fulfills all of that, even in traditional Christianity, but in ways that are unexpected. Because I think that the needs that are being serviced by that are serviced by. I think that the Christian storytellers had to service those needs, but they came up with creative solutions based on their understanding of Jesus. So first one is what Jesus, the hero's warrior, right?
Uh-huh.
So again,
something.
I mean, I'm sure the Crusaders and others militants throughout history have seen Jesus as the ultimate physical warrior, right?
Right.
And there are verses that you could interpret that way. There's the very famous verse, "I did not bring peace, but to bring a sword," right? That can be interpreted in many ways, but that's you can take it literally. There's also a verse that a lot of people aren't familiar with. I believe it's in Luke, where he says, "Anyone who denies me as king, bring them before me and kill them," right? So there's some verses out there that sound pretty violent, right? And so most Christians historically have seen Jesus as the Prince of Peace, because in the Christian narrative, he is someone who does not resist being falsely accused, being tortured, being killed, right? He turn your other cheek. There's also
hero, martyr, which is not on the list. Yeah.
Exactly. So, but we'll get to that in a second in this warrior thing. But again, I've heard so many times devout Christians will say to me, Jesus is the ultimate warrior. What they mean is he's the warrior against evil. He's the warrior against lies, and he's the peaceful warrior, right? The way of the peaceful warrior, like that Millman book, right? And actually, there's an Islamic component to that, because the Prophet Muhammad is famous for having said that after coming back from a battle, he said, "What we just went through is the lesser jihad." Jihad means to struggle in the service of God. And the people said, his followers, his companions said, "Well, that's the lesser jihad? That was a pretty intense battle, right? What's the greatest jihad, if that's the lesser one?" And he said the greatest jihad is to fight the evil inside yourself. It's self-restraint. It is moral rectitude. It is not giving into temptation. It is to, turn the other cheek. That's the greatest jihad, right? Because it's the hardest thing to do. It's not hard to fight somebody. It's much harder to restrain yourself. So Jesus is a warrior, even by that definition, as a pacifist as many interpret him to be, right? So that's where he's a warrior. But this idea of martyr, again, within Islam, the martyr, because he's, with no apologies, Islam has military elements to it, right? I mean, if people critique it for that, right? It is not a pacifist religion. It believes in fighting, and it believes in fighting for righteousness. Muslims will certainly interpret that as fighting in self-defense with very specific rules of war. Can't kill women, can't kill children, can't kill priests. Those were all rules war delineated by Islam at a time when there were no rules of war. The Romans just killed everybody. The Persians killed everybody. The idea of a rule of war didn't exist. Islam had these rules of war. So, but there's no apology that Islam has a militant aspect to it within its own sense of righteousness and justice, right? So, so within that, one of the things that you could say was a motivator. Like Christian critics of Islam could say, "You guys created an army of fanatics that conquered the Middle East," and one of the things that motivated them was the idea that if they died on the battlefield as martyrs, that they didn't actually die. They instantly became immortal beings. They were transmogrified into something else. The Quran actually says that. The Quran says a shaheed, and the word martyr means witness, someone who sees the truth of things. A shaheed do not call them dead. They are alive, but you cannot perceive it with your senses. So it's a very specific thing in the Quran that the martyr is not actually dead. They're ontologically alive.
They're immortal, yeah.
They're alive. They're just in another dimension, but they're actually alive. They're not in the same place that a dead person's soul is residing. They're actually alive, and it says that, and God has provided them sustenance. So they're eating and drinking and living in some physical form in that other dimension and experiencing an actual life, right? And so for the Christian, Jesus is the ultimate martyr. He dies for your sins, for the sins of all mankind, and then comes back to life.
But then Christianity also, just in tradition, has just endless stories of martyrs, and like that's like it becomes very internalized.
The first 3 centuries, it's martyrs that don't fight back like Jesus and get set on fire and eaten by lions. After Constantine, it's martyrs that fight on the battlefield, right? Because Constantine sees the cross burning on a battlefield, which please understand at the time was really shocking to Christians.
But even in the modern day, I think martyrdom is very, very important in a lot of versions.
It is because you're following Jesus' path, right?
Exactly, he's your ultimate hero, so you'd want to.
Yeah, and but that's a warrior. He's fighting evil in this way. So that's one. So what's the second one?
Hero as lover. And that one.
Okay, this is interesting. Yeah. So let's go with the traditional Christianity. Let's go with Gnosticism. Let's go with Islam. Just on Jesus.
Gnosticism is another one of my favorite versions.
So traditional Christianity, Jesus doesn't get married. No Da Vinci Code stuff. He doesn't marry Mary Magdalene. Doesn't have a secret love child. That's traditional Christianity. Is that Jesus is celibate his entire life, never experiences sexual relations, does not have a partner. That was not in his mission, right? Okay, but what do Christians refer to the church as? They refer to it as the bride of Christ. Right. So you couldn't get the idea out. The archetype of the hero having a bride is central to Christianity. You can't get it out. You need it. The hero has to have a partner. And the church becomes the bride. So that's in Orthodox Christianity. Gnosticism, well, the Gnostic Gospels got Jesus kissing Mary Magdalene on the lips. She's called his partner. I mean, there's, in the Gnostic Gospels, you got Peter complaining to Jesus saying, "You love Mary more than us." I mean, there seems to be a sexual romantic relationship in the Gnostic Gospel. So this idea of Jesus being a romantic lover existed amongst the Gnostics. Okay. And then in Islam, the Quran does not mention any wife or child of Jesus. It doesn't at all, right? But it's not in any way opposed to it. If you told me Mary Magdalene was his wife, that doesn't affect my Islamic faith, because the Quran says that all the prophets of God, in order for them to teach people, had to be people. They had, and the Quran says all the prophets had wives and children. So that's a verse in the Quran. So all the prophets, one will kind of presume that must include Jesus, right? And so, because how can you teach anybody if you don't know what their struggle is, that they're having, there's great stories in the Islamic tradition of the prophet and his wife arguing, and getting upset with each other. And then they learn, and then, they learn and they reconcile. And then that's the example of how you work it out in a marriage. Because now the holy man himself is having a problem with his partner, right?
Yeah.
And this is how you work it out. So now you got an example.
From like a storytelling or like structural perspective, It's an interesting thing to note about the bride of Christ too. You could see that, like, part of what Jesus is doing in these stories, of course, he's doing a lot of things, but he's rescuing that bride. Like there's an element of kind of saving the maiden, almost saving the whole world.
Exactly. He saved literally from the dragon. Satan is called the dragon. So he's saving the maiden, which is the humanity, which is the church, from the dragon, by taking on all of its, bad karma onto himself. It's the ultimate lover sacrifice. Give me everything you got, baby. I got it all onto me, and I will destroy myself so that you can live. And in the process, I will find life and we'll be together forever. That's romance
that's true.
In a mythical sense.
And the third one, hero, is emperor/tyrant. I think if you take out the tyrant part, it's very obvious that he falls into that. It was like,
he's the king, right?
He's bringing enlightenment and wisdom straight from a divine source. Yeah, Jesus.
That's Christ, right? And it's central, because that's why the nativity has to have him come from David, because it can't be that, right? And again, I'm not so sure that the Quranic Jesus is not necessarily from David. He seems to be from Aaron without any Davidic thing. So, there's no guarantee that the Quranic Jesus is a king. And it's interesting because, so the Islamic view of the second coming is that Jesus returns at the end of time, physically descends from the heavens, defeats this false Messiah who's essentially taken his mantle and proclaimed himself, right, as the true Son of God, the servant of God, whatever, proclaimed himself, and he destroys them. And then this is the Islam. Again, it's not in the Quran, although there's some implication of the Quran about this. But this is an Islamic tradition that then the Islamic tradition then says he dwells for 40 years in the world, teaching human beings, like traveling the world. I mean, I don't know. In modern day, would he get on an airplane? I mean, he used donkeys, whatever. It'd be interesting. Jesus returns. Does he get on like a flight, like to go to China? I mean, it's interesting. It's an interesting idea. People never think about it. Like Jesus comes back. Does he actually like get in a car? I mean, how does he do his mission, right? But it's an interesting idea. So, but then he travels the world, spreads, Islam, is surrender to one God, and then he gets married and has children in the Islamic tradition. So even if he didn't do it with Mary Magdalene, or he did it back then and he's back now on this earth, right? He gets married and has children, and then he dies, right? But it's not really an Islamic idea that he rules the earth. It's more that he goes and teaches people.
And that's not because, in part because, of course, he's more of a minor character in Islam, whereas in Christianity, of course, he's the main hero. So it's interesting.
Well, I mean, I would say he's minor. He's number 2 in the story. I mean, Christians won't accept that, but he's number 2 in the story.
But I just mean comparatively, of course, he fulfills a different role, and so that's really fascinating that you brought that, what you're bringing up, that like he does in Christianity, he is all 5. If you include martyr, he's not
really the emperor in Islam. He's not really the king. So
Yeah, but in Christianity, he really is all those. That's really fascinating because, again, as Joseph Campbell brings it up, he's talking about stories, an individual story where the hero is just one of these things. So the fact that, I mean, of course, it's obvious that you can have a hero that's the first two, but it's cool to notice that like one of the most popular heroes in history has all of these, and so maybe that's part of the reason why that resonates.
Well, he has to, and then I would just say the Prophet Muhammad has that directly. So he is a warrior. He's actually he fights in battles. He's actually a warrior objectively. He is a king. He ends up ruling this nation and establishes laws that don't exist before, right? He's a lover. He has a wife. He's got children, right? He's got grandchildren, and then he's also a lawgiver like Moses. He comes and he's literally giving people that have no legal system a legal system, right? That's one thing that people don't understand, the difference between Christianity and Islam. One of the most central differences: Jesus is not actually a lawgiver in that sense. Moses is, because Moses is giving new rules, the Torah and these rules, and the Prophet Muhammad is. Jesus is born into a world where there's already laws. There's the Israelite laws from the Torah, right? But practically there's the Roman laws. He's living in a world where there's Roman soldiers and courts, and he actually says in the gospel, somebody comes up to him and says, can you resolve this dispute I'm having with my brother over property or something, right? And Jesus says, go in the gospel. He says, go to the court. It's not my problem. I'm not here for that. There's a court system, right? So he can go and there's like soldiers. That's how he gets arrested. There's a legal system that exists, right? And that doesn't exist in Moses because he's out there in the desert with nobody, right? At this mountain with nobody in charge except him. So he's got to give him rules, right? And the Prophet Muhammad is living in a world where there's no laws. There's literally no laws. It's just a libertarian free-for-all in the desert, right? Rich do whatever the hell they can afford to do. So he has to establish laws. So people always like, well, the Prophet Muhammad had this rule and that rule. Jesus didn't have to establish a state. Jesus didn't need to. I mean, he had a state. He lived in a country. Moses and Muhammad didn't live in a country. They had to create a country.